presenters, and Marcia, I'll let you introduce yourself so they can get accustomed to your voice also.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcia McMahon. I work here at Peters & Associates with Bruce. We have known each other for many years and have worked on compliance things dating together back into the Y2K days.
Yes. Going back a few years, yes, exactly. And I'm Bruce. I'm the Vice President of Business Strategy. Been in the industry for a while. Certainly working on compliance matters for a long time, and this compliance matter, like many others, is one that requires a bit of an approach, and I think that it also requires distilling down a lot of the language and the policies and the guidance that ultimately is morphing a little bit, and it's kind of in its second rev. And we've got the latest guidance. We've distilled it down, and we think that within 40 minutes you're not going to be a DFARS expert, but you're going to know whether you're in or out. You're going to know and I think have a feeling as to whether this is something that you need to attack, and if you are to attack, maybe how to attack. So those are generally the primary goals. So again, like the agenda had mentioned, we're going to try and break this down into just a little bit of background first, and then we're going to go into dive right into how to tackle this, and what we think are 5 concrete steps you can do to execute against this plan. And we'll give you some examples as we have a number of customers that we've been helping through this process through the years. Some dating back, a few years back in terms of their efforts towards this compliance standard. So DFARS is also known as by some other cybersecurity standards. All of these cybersecurity standards tend to derive from NIST. NIST is, do you remember, Marcia, its exact acronym? National Institutes of Standards and Technology, I believe.
Very good.
Sounds good. Okay. And NIST is a body that drives compliance standards, and they tend to create these for they're not governmental, but oftentimes the government does pick them up as the authoritative bodies to create compliance standards. And there's a number that have been created. We know that ourselves, being in the security space, we've been working with the cybersecurity framework, which we think is pretty simple, and that's part of the reason why we believe in the cybersecurity framework. But the cybersecurity framework is just an oversimplification, as kind of pictured here, that allows you to kind of step into security and know that there are 5 major tenets to it: the identifying what assets you're going to protect, the protecting the assets themselves with technical controls and other people controls and process controls, detection of when there is an issue, how do I know about it and who gets alerted, responding to those alerts, and then ultimately, if the problem is bad enough, recovering from that if there's a need to recover, whether that be a DR plan or an incident response plan. So in general, that's the cybersecurity framework that our organization leverages in a lot of our conversations to frame this with customers. This just provides a little bit of background as we step into one of NIST's very specific control sets that's meant for, as the word says, protecting controlled, unclassified information, and we'll kind of break this down a little bit, unpack this, in non-federal systems and organizations. So, okay, reading between the words, basically it's stuff that we haven't decided is really, really important, but it's pretty important, and it exists in suppliers to our government that we really don't want other people to know about how that stuff is created. Some examples might be airplane parts, airplane engines, manufacturing of specialized components that goes in weaponry, fuel pumps that might be sold to certain areas of the government. So basically, the government had capacity to protect their own systems when it's a government entity, but for the supply chain, they needed a standard that reached out. And so they created one called 800-171, or DFARS. This is all based on also a larger compliance standard called 800-53, which has existed for a long time. I won't, drill into the details on 853, but just think of it as a stepping stone, that this is a very specific classification standard, and only certain data and suppliers might be subject to it. So we'll kind of differentiate those. Okay, another differentiation between the that's very specific around DFARS or 800-171 is the fact that it's very focused on confidentiality. There are other elements that oftentimes people are worried about, such as availability of information or integrity of information. This doesn't care about it. It really just focuses on confidentiality. It's meant for systems that were of medium impact, meaning if this was a critical supply chain item, it would probably be labeled a little higher. And basically, it's a subset of the larger standard of 800-53. Okay, big slide full. I'll break this down for you. We all need to understand as we kind of walk into this that the standard is around CUI, or controlled unclassified information. And it has some history with regards to it, but I'd point the arrows, if you will, and in fact I'll even literally point the arrows, so draw your attention to this is what you care about. You, as an organization, likely have or may have in your future a DoD contract. And the DoD contract, the government has the capability to say, wow, the data that's contained within this contract, if you would like to save it, or if you would like to be a participant in this contract, will have CUI data. Are you capable of handling CUI data? Because our CUI data is now protected under DFARS. And if you're DFARS compliant, you're going to say, yes, we're capable of participating in that contract, and you know exactly what that entails. If you're not, then you may not be able to participate in the contract. So really, at the end of the day, this is about the continuation of business, maybe as you have it today, as a supplier of defense industry, or participating tomorrow as a green field and a new area to participate in. Okay. Again, it's a management decision, not an IT decision, as to whether you'll participate in this contract and whether you have the capacity to do so. Controlled unclassified information is determined up at the government level. I don't know what effort and exercises they go through, but it's not a determination made by you or by a supplier. It's actually made by the government and specified specifically in contracts that this contract deals with CUI data. And so for some businesses that might represent a majority of their business, in others, and presumably they would have a lot of these efforts already underway. In others, it might be a future frontier or maybe a smaller portion of your business, and you're waiting for someone to have a contract that gets handed to you with CUI. And so you're just kind of doing some orientation work now. Okay, so in terms of the how-to, maybe Marcia, you want to kind of take a few moments here and just kind of talk about the compliance how-to, and I'll go into the 5 steps here.
Yeah, so basically, as Bruce had stated earlier, the how to be compliant part of DFARS is really related to protecting controlled unclassified information. So again, it's not an IT exercise. It's really almost more of a policy exercise. We absolutely want to look at the technical controls that are in place relative to NIST 800-171, but the compliance portion is largely documentation based. So Bruce will talk about the first set of documentation right here, the DFARS Policy.
Yes. So first, we're going to kind of give you the overview here. We've got 5 things we've identified are important to be compliant, and I would differentiate the idea of compliance with secure. Okay. You can be compliant without necessarily being secure. You can also be compliant and not necessarily have everything in place today. Think of this more as a journey, and what you've done is make a statement that you're going to participate in this journey. And there are 5 critical elements to kind of work towards in the beginning of this journey. A is DFARS policy itself, and we'll break down each of these in a little bit more detail. But second is having a system security plan, or a DFARS system security plan, or SSP. The acronyms you will find to be funny as you kind of walk along this and at least get you oriented to some of the terminology. The system security plan can follow, if you have a security plan that's already in place for protection of your information within your organization, great. That may serve directly as a system security plan. You just need to validate that they are one and the same. You don't necessarily need to go off a different segue. There's also something called a POAM, or a Plan of Action and Milestones. Okay. Again, using the industry term. D is capability to have a medium assurance digital certificate. Again, we'll break down some of these. And the fifth one is a flow down of DFARS requirements, meaning are there suppliers either up or downstream from you upon which you're going to have contractual obligations. And again, we'll dive into details on each one of these. So without further ado, let's kind of dive in on the DFARS policy, or A, as one of the 5 areas. DFARS policy, again, was meant, if we kind of looked at what policies are relative to maybe some other terms that are used. Again, the goal here is to differentiate policy from things you might have today. Maybe you have some how-to documents, as an example. Great. How-to documents are very important, but they usually serve a different purpose closer to the top of the pyramid there, when they're closer to something that maybe an IT person might read, or a end-of-line business person might read. They tend to be guidelines or procedures. If they're kind of in the middle area, there can be controls or standards. But policy is usually set out at a business level. It is, what do we want to do? What's our intent? Do we intend to, and we'll give some examples of this, but what is the intent is usually what's laid out in policy terms. And usually there's very few tactical or guidance level words or items left within there. So at the policy level, as we kind of move in, and I'd also kind of back rev just to say we're including the very latest guidance here. 800-171 is the standard that drives DFARS. However, the 800-171 draft, as I mentioned, version 2, if you will, is already out. And so we're trying to incorporate that guidance into our conversation today. So a policy should address the following areas. Again, you're going to make bold statements with regards to your intentions in your policy document, but you're going to want to make policy statements around the 14 families that DFARS wants you to be concerned about. How do you hire employees? Are these employees separate from, are the employees that work with DFARS data separate from your normal employee base? Do you hire them with any special needs or any special certifications? Do you have termination procedures? What does onboarding and training look like with regards to this? So again, these are high-level statements you're making regarding the 14 families here, whether they be from employees or processes to technical controls. Looked at a different way, the DFARS standard has actually numbered these 1 through 14, and so when you're creating a policy, oftentimes, whether it be your existing policy or from scratch, you're going to want to take those policies and fold them into section headings that directly assess these. So you can imagine your document here, your policy, is kind of getting built out, and here's your table of contents from a beginning standpoint. You can kind of dive into further details under the 3.1 family. You can keep going down in terms of details that you'd see. But again, these details don't all need to get addressed at a policy level. Sometimes just some broad statements might address one or many items within a family. So within this family of 3.1, as an example, called access control, you'll see several examples of some of the controls that they're expecting, listing out a total of 110 total controls that need to be reviewed. So the policy document, again, just to kind of recap, is meant to be high level and broad statements, and we'll show you some examples of how a policy document differentiates from what we're going to talk about now, or what Marcia will talk about now, under the system security plan. And Marcia, just have me, I can continue advancing the slides if you'd like.
Oh, yes, please do. So the system security plan differs from the policy in that it can be multiple documents. So, of course, your policy, your DFARS policy document is part of this overall plan, but part of the plan is also a management plan and identifying the team members that are part of the plan. So one of the first things we want to talk about in your system security plan is actually the management team and identifying who fits these roles. So who is your CUI leader? You know, who is your defense division director, or what is the title of that person that should be really leading up all of these efforts? You will, of course, have an IT leader, you know, vice president, director of IT, someone in that type of role. There will also be an IT specialist, someone that could be within your organization, or if you were partnering with us, oftentimes we're actually listed in a role there. You also would have an audit leader, because with any good compliance effort, we will have an auditor. Now, this could be someone internally auditing, but it may also be a named external auditor. Within this, one of the most important roles is the CUI data owner and the systems owner. So these are contract dependent. So what we need more than anything out of these roles in the organization, and we want to stress to everyone, is that it's not just IT. One of the most important roles here is who is going to identify what contract has CUI data in it that's subject to DFARS. So the responsibility of that role really needs to be assigned, and that's really important so that we can identify, does this contract contain CUI data? Therefore, we need to now act on this and follow these things. And more importantly, this contract doesn't contain CUI data, so off it goes into a separate pile. And I think that it's important to stress that whoever that person is, they have a very important role in this, because it's on their say whether the contract needs to be subject to all of these controls. So once we have these parties identified, their roles are pretty simple, right? The HR person is quite simply the HR person, all of their normal things for user administration and continuing education and all the things that HR normally would be responsible for. So that kind of covers the roles. The documentation, click.
One other comment I guess I'd make on that is, and I guess I'll ask it as a Q&A. Would you prefer to have the policy document state people's names or roles?
Absolutely roles.
And why is that?
Within the document, there would be a section to identify who all these people are. I would say the CUI leader by title, and then you may have an appendix that you would identify who that person is, their email address, their phone number, all of their contact information, so that then when you update staffing, you're only updating that appendix, and the policy still holds true that the person who has this title is responsible for this role. And then as the HR landscape changes, people come and go from organizations, we wouldn't want a named person to be in an existing policy, especially a policy with this type of compliance implications. We would just want a separate appendix to actually spell out the vice president is Bruce Warden. This is his email address and this is his phone number.
Perfect. Yeah, and again, I think that's partially because, as a reminder, policies were meant to be high level, right? And they're not meant to change often. This is a direction and intent document, and the direction and intent of your organization relative to DFARS should not be changing with much frequency. And so make it easy on yourself. Keep the policy high level from that perspective with regards to intent. Don't put names in there, put roles, so that, again, changes don't need to be made. So with that said, I think we're going to go into a couple examples, and Marcia, maybe you can walk us through. These are examples of DFARS policy, and I think we picked a couple sections here from the control set DFARS Policy versus the SSP or plan, which is another level of detail.
Right. So if you look at this, this pretty much ties right back to the 800-171 directive from NIST and the numbering, and you then fill in the blanks of how often are you going to fulfill this audit requirement. Is it annual? Is it monthly? What are you going to do in specific events? And are you capable of doing all of this internally? Do you need to coordinate with someone else to get that done? So that would kind of be part of your policy document set versus the system security document set might be a little bit different, and it might define actually what's going to happen. Real time, for example, if you had a SIM, what would happen, who would get notified, what's going on in Active Directory, you know, the impossible traveler, those kind of technical controls, and then define, again, your audit schedule weekly, monthly, annually, quarterly, whichever it is to audit those types of events.
I think we have one more example kind of going back. I'll call this example 2.
Yeah, so within the policy on this particular example, it's talking about, you know, kind of an individual screening, background checks, what to do in the event of a termination. This would be the type of thing that would be covered within your policy set. And again, with the 3.9 numbering, ties right back to the NIST control set.
That's the example of policy, and then we were going to the SSP.
Again, it's a little bit different. It still ties back with a numbering scheme, but it also throws responsibility onto the specific roles, right? So it's saying ultimately the CUI leader is responsible for this, the HR manager is responsible for that, the IT leader is responsible. So it's laying responsibility for the roles, not just what's actually going to happen. So it's, again, it's the SSP, think of it as almost like a management plan. It's not just what's going to happen, but also who is responsible for what's going to happen.
Right, and I think we tried to make it easy by obviously identifying key decisions that might be made in terms of timeframes or roles or frequency with regards to, you know, things like this. So this is certainly where you know, your procedures are going to come into play and maybe get baked into the SSP document, things of like that. And in some cases, you need to create procedures, right? We don't have a good documented process for how we do terminations today. Maybe we need one, right? And so, you know, oftentimes, you know, this is where some of the work actually comes into play, where decisions need to get made. Great. I think that covers our, you know, section 2. So policy and SSP or security plan have been the 2 items to date. The third item is nobody has all of this stuff all figured out. Okay, nobody is, as I mentioned earlier, this is a journey, and you're not at the end of the journey when you begin. Okay, so there are certainly going to be gaps with regards to, I don't know, either some controls you don't have in place today, some procedures that need to be written, some personnel that need to get trained, some contracts that need to have some additional language put in them, and all of these are going to fall into resulting work. And that resulting work has to have a priority. It has to have it has to tie back probably to a standard that DFARS, you know, DFARS or the 800-171 regulation would tie into. So, for example, if you don't have an employee termination policy, that ties right into 3.9, right? And so it just has some categorization and identification. And so what we've done in the past to help our customers along with this and to have a plan of action basically is help them create either a spreadsheet or something otherwise that helps them stay organized. And some of the fields that we use are identified here. And you know, you can kind of imagine the spreadsheet. It kind of can get as small or as, you know, simple or as complex as you'd like. But you know, there are items along the top that you're trying to address. You've got maybe someone who's responsible for it. You know, when things will get done, and I wrote down just some of the other fields you might expect to see within a spreadsheet. And again, This is ultimately up to you. There's no standard as to how this is done. How do you drive projects internally? How do you keep track of what's necessary? Risk ratings, supporting documents, deviation rationale. If there's time at the conclusion of this, we'll actually show you another way to do this, or a portal for managing all of this information, including, something that might assemble the supporting documents or have the ability to assign things to points of contact without everybody, managing a spreadsheet in a subdirectory folder. There are other ways to do that that are included. If you have certain technology, and we'll kind of look at Microsoft's technology for doing that. But plan of action is nothing but a plan for the gaps with regards to where they're at. Is there anything, I guess, further that you wanted to say on that, Marcia?
No, I think that's it exactly. It's a journey, so you're going to start this journey and identify that you have gaps, and the fact that you document the gaps helps you become compliant. No one is expecting you to have every hole and notch buttoned up, but if you identify the gaps, say where my gap is, and establish a remediation plan and anticipated goal date, you are then meeting your compliance requirement.
It's also very helpful too when, if not that the DFARS is auditable at this point, but if you have a finding from a different audit or from something, this can be a helpful output, if you will, for that. So, if somebody of authority is saying within your organization, boy, we really need this, and if it can fold into a process that's already developed, I think this is a helpful way to go. So. Okay, so we'll move on to D. D and E, which are the fourth and fifth areas for compliance, are actually relatively straightforward, and I think Marcia is going to kind of walk us through what a medium assurance digital certificate is.
Yeah.
I point back to this only because I think from my talking point on this, in any framework that you deliver, whether it be DFARS or otherwise, you will note that there's a large part of the compliance puzzle that is intended for you to respond when things don't go as you had planned. Okay, things happen. Okay, it's almost unavoidable to have a perfect world when it comes to security. For those imperfections, you need to have your responses pre-thought out. You need to provide notifications. You need to tell people. You need to, be able to recover from it in an adequate way. So right now, the focus of this specific guidance is simply to respond and respond effectively. And Marcia will tell us more about it.
Yeah, so as you walk through creating your system security policy, one area of the policy will be incident response, and you will document what you need to do. Well, in order to be compliant with DFARS and incident response, you will have to actually make notification. So when you go to make notification to the government, there will be a portal that you go to. In order to get through the portal, you are required to have already obtained a median assurance digital certificate. So just like in any other NIST area, in order to report a cyber incident, the contractor or the subcontractor will need to have a DoD approved digital certificate. It's not a big deal to get, really. You need to kind of go through this process where you apply. Don't think of it as a technical certificate like you would apply to a server or a website. This is actually getting out identification forms, proving that who you are, having things notarized. It's not hard to do. There are some fees involved, because everybody's got to, charge you to get this, but it's really not a big deal to go through the process to get it, and you apply for it, you bring in your passport and your IDs, driver's license or whatever, and you submit them and you get the certificate. Once you have it, then when you actually need to act on reporting an incident, that's how they identify that you are who you said you are and you're representing the institution that you said you represent, so that you can properly report an incident that if one had transpired.
And I kind of think of this outside the box a little bit. If you think about this from a government perspective, why are we reporting this? What's in it? The end game and the whole reason for this regulation, if we go back to the intent of this, was to protect data that is part of the supply chain to the defense industry for parts that may or may not be important. If they are getting notifications from several different suppliers of bearings that go into, that they may say, hey, there tends to be a trend for somebody trying to find out information about this, and it might warrant further investigation, if you will, from some authorities to go find out exactly what's happening. So the notification serves a purpose, obviously, from a compliance perspective, but ultimately does serve probably a higher order purpose with regards to what information is trying to be ascertained. The fifth and final component is flow down requirements, and we have a single slide, I think, to kind of just eloquate this. This is not a field of expertise necessarily for Peters and Associates, though we can speak to it. This is primarily a legal matter. As you can imagine, DFARS itself is simply an indication that you are supposed to be part of a supply chain, and that you are handling CUI data, probably on behalf of maybe a primary. Maybe you're supplying parts to a primary and you're a subcontractor yourselves, or you as a contractor may have subcontractors. So certainly some of your contracts are going to define who's a contractor, who's a subcontractor, things of that nature. You're going to define other elements that are out here listed, limitations of liability, warranty, and so forth. So essentially the goal here is to make sure that your contracts properly reflect the language should you have downstream suppliers to you that you're subcontracting out. That's really the goal of it, and basically it's each of these 5 steps that we had kind of highlighted were all intended to, again, get you compliant and to begin the journey. They're not necessarily, there is no such thing as no end state with regards to, there is an end state with regards to being compliant. There's not an end state with regards to being secure or fulfilling all your compliance obligations and saying, I have nothing left to do. Think of it as your POAM is probably going to continue on and likely will have some elements on it that you're still working on that next quarter or next year. These are items you intend to go at to continue to enhance your security plan. So as part of a wrap, I thought we'd just kind of talk about trying to not have this be your view of DFARS, right? It's not a bunch of products and processes and so forth. This is simply sometimes people have this view of the security industry, and our goal is to try and distill things down and make things a little bit easier. We've got some information out there that's generic in nature with regards to security. We certainly have some events that are that we think could be helpful, again, with regards to security in general, maybe different compliance standards. On the left, we've got some webinars around GDPR or specific around 365. Each month, we have some security awareness training that we do for a half an hour as a webinar and just kind of tell you what's been going on for the last month through some newsworthy stories. We have an in-person event that's listed here on June 28th. In the afternoon. We're planning on visiting a few restaurants in the area. They're all within walkable distance, and we're going to break our groups, hoping to have 100+ people at this event, and break us into 4 groups where we can kind of go around and get a taste of some half-an-hour discussions around security elements while tasting some decent food. So we also have some blogs. Some of these were sent to you in some emails. In most recently around some efforts we're doing to raise the awareness around DFARS and otherwise, but these specific blogs were with regards to DFARS and maybe some background on it.